So welcome everyone to a conversation with Dr. Indira Nath, a member of the Executive Committee of the International Human Rights Network of Academies and Scholarly Societies, or the IHRN. My name is Rebecca Everly. I'm the Executive Director of the IHRN. It's a collection of national honorary scientific societies around the world, more than 80, with a shared interest in human rights. And this conversation, which will focus on COVID-19, discrimination, and stigma, is part of a larger project of the IHRN, which highlights the implications of the pandemic for human rights. I'm absolutely delighted to be speaking with Dr. Nath, who is a renowned immunologist. She's the former founder and head of the Department of Biotechnology at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. Dr. Nath has really made pioneering contributions to immunology research in human leprosy, or Hansen's disease. And she has a huge bio that we will be posting on our site along with this video. But since this is the IHRN is a network of academies, I'd like to mention that Dr. Nath is a fellow of the 3 National Science Academies in India, the National Academy of Medical Sciences in India, the Royal College of Pathology in the UK, and the World Academy of Sciences. Dr. Nath has received numerous national and international awards for her work, including the Indian Padma. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Nath.
Thank you.
Before we begin, I just want to provide a little bit of background about the conversation that we'll be having. Yeah. So globally, we've been seeing many cases of stigmatization of individuals and groups in connection with COVID-19. Cases in which these individuals have been discriminated against, and in some cases subjected to violence. In the United States, where I'm based, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention have really drawn attention to this problem and pointed out, for instance, instances of stigma and discrimination against minority communities. In that context, I want to highlight the fact that numerous US organizations have documented thousands, since the beginning of the pandemic, thousands of cases, COVID-related hate incidents directed at members of the Asian and the Asian American community in the United States. But the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has pointed to instances of stigma and violence against other groups as well. I will not give an exhaustive list, but just as a few examples, attacks have been directed toward people who have had COVID-19 or people who have COVID-19 currently, healthcare providers and other frontline workers, including grocery store workers and delivery drivers, and people who are experiencing homelessness. So COVID-19, as I mentioned, it's certainly not only a problem in the United States. There have been reported cases in many parts of the world. And to give you a sense of the type of impact that it's having on individuals, there have been reports of individuals and groups being evicted from their homes, denied access to social services, in some cases subjected to verbal and physical abuse, occasionally within their own, sometimes within their own communities and from their own neighbors. International human rights experts have really sounded the alarm about this, and they have called upon states to ensure that their approaches to the pandemic are rooted in human rights law and are aimed at promoting non-discrimination and equality. And crucially, international human rights bodies have insisted that states must ensure that they don't further whip up fear and violence within their states. And finally, just to say that the problems that we're seeing, they really demonstrate the complicated ways in which health and human rights challenges overlap. And we know that the association between illness and stigma in society has a really long history, and that that history has been reinforced by racism and xenophobia and other types of prejudice. But we know at the same time that there's a long history of efforts to combat stigma and discrimination. And so it's important to learn from that history to help inform our actions going forward. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be able to talk through these issues with you, Dr. Nath, particularly since you have spoken and written so eloquently about stigma and discrimination in connection with leprosy. So thank you so much for being here. And to get started and provide some perspective, could you tell us a little bit about your work to combat leprosy, and also how you've seen stigma and discrimination manifest in connection with the disease?
Right. Well, I've been mainly working in the immunology of the patients that have leprosy. And it's an interesting disease, both intellectually, fascinates microbiologists, clinicians, immunologists, and now even the molecular biologists. Because the disease presents as what we call a spectrum. At one end you have a generalized disease and the kind of horrible pictures you see of earlobes being thickened and facial lumps on the face, etc. And on the other hand, you have patients who have been infected with the same bug, and sometimes in the same locality, and they have just a white patch, which may heal by itself or which may get a little worse and needs treatment. Mm-hmm. So this makes it fascinating from the clinical point of view also, to know how to treat one group again, as compared to the other group. In between, you have a varied spectrum also of symptoms and signs. And the thing I got fascinated with, I came across leprosy when I was an undergraduate doing what we call an MBBS degree in medicine. One of our tutors used to go to the local leprosarium, near the river, where the patients were all segregated into slum-like areas. And he would take me along to bandage them and, and to look after them at the weekends. And that's when I sort of got faced with the stigma problem also, because they had to be isolated. They were isolated from the main city, partly maybe because at that time in the 80s and 60s, I would say, they were not really accepted in the city, and they faced stigma.
In what ways did you also see that stigma occur, and then possibly even be a challenge for researchers working to combat the disease?
Right. I think the stigma is much less now, I must admit. At least in India, I see stigma is much less. But at the time when I first started, you're absolutely right. Like the rest of the world, a lot of Asia and Brazil and everywhere, even in US, they were put away into leprosaria, separated. Yeah. And when I first came to US, to Louisiana, and sort of saw the patient in one hospital, it was, again, quite heartbreaking. I think it was because of that, the stigma attached to leprosy is biblical, let's face it, right? It's really ancient. And that stigma, if you ask me, overflows, even when the stigma is more or less gone now, because we have good drugs and we don't have to see patients with deformities if they're treated in time. And so the deformity is one that immediately draws attention of society, that you've got something wrong. And that is reduced. So, but somehow the concept of stigma, which was associated from biblical times, carries on, And there's a famous picture of Mahatma Gandhi, whose friend had leprosy, and he's bathing him and, looking after him. Even then, I've been to that area, looked at patients there, the stigma was still there at that time. I think as we started talking about it openly, and in the news or in documentaries, and people talking about it, now it's curable and therefore there's nothing to be afraid of. People started coming out and telling us that they had a patch and will you please look at it, and and things like that. So I think information and a cure, of course, makes a big difference. Yeah. And if you tell them, if you come early, you'll be cured, then of course the fear is much less.
Pleasant, yeah. And it's interesting, again, this issue about the intersection between health and human rights. in reading about stigma and this stigma and discrimination that's happening, a lot of the discussion, rightly, is about the impact on individuals being subjected to violence or abuse, and their families. But of course, we know that stigma related to illness can have really serious public health implications. So based on your background, could you just tell us a little bit about problems that can occur when stigmatized individuals are afraid to speak out about their illnesses and then don't seek treatment?
Right. I think that happened a lot with leprosy, especially women, were afraid to come out and show their patches when we would go to the villages, because they were afraid they'll be then, stigmatized, and their daughters won't get married. The whole family gets disconnected. And you see it with patients too, in India, when in my earlier years, patients would be coming all the way from, states which are thousands of miles away. They'll come all the way from the village to Delhi to get treated, rather than go to the neighboring one, and then the community will come to know they have the disease.
Right.
And this is, even now, we see a lot of patients coming, not because there's no treatment in that state, but just to avoid the stigma. That's one. And then they come late. And that's what we're seeing with COVID also in Delhi. The director of All India Institute of Medical Sciences, where I come from, he had seen patients. Most of them were coming in the earlier years, I think in the earlier months, I would say. Maybe it's better now. But in the earlier months, they were coming a bit late after they developed the respiratory symptoms and things like that. And then, the morbidity, as we say, goes up. The complications are more, and more of them need ICU and, oxygen and things like that. The other thing that we are seeing about, for instance, COVID, which has also happened with leprosy, is the nurses and doctors who treat them. They're also being attacked, as you mentioned in your introductory remarks, even in India. And that was also, again, in the months. I don't see so many reports of this happening in the recent months, now that there is talk of vaccine, and we know that, fewer people are dying, and, you just get mild symptoms, most of you, and then only a few need ventilation and things like that. So that has gone down a bit. Otherwise, our young doctors, who were renting accommodation, the landlords wanted to throw them. And in fact, the Home Minister had to intervene when they appealed to him and said, look, this is what's happening. Then he had to intervene, and then the landlords realized.
I mean, as you say, it's so important to provide clear information about the pandemic, as up to date as you can, based in science, although there are so many things that we don't know. And then, there's also this issue about addressing, that's important for its own sake, of course, but then also to help hopefully stem the rumors and the untruths that can cause fear and violence and stigma.
Of course, the government does talk about stigma, not to have stigma. A lot of TV coverage, even I came on, talking about it, etc. But I think it's a societal change, finally, that, that gets rid of the stigma. Government can only do so much, and media, of course, is very useful, especially nowadays with your TV and social media, can help a lot. And with COVID, in a way, I don't know, sometimes I think media may not have expressed itself, as it should have, in the sense they were concentrated on projecting the number of cases that came up, and how many have died, how many are active. Even now we get these statistics, and I see that with your CNN also. I think we have to give figures and be very honest with the disease, that we don't know much about it, and when we do know something, we should say it very clearly. And at the moment, the misinformation in COVID is so much, because you hear, you know, political leaders saying one thing and the experts saying something else. And that's not very good for society. In the end, it's a society which has to change its behavior. How to make it change, I think, varies from country to country. In our country, certainly religious leaders are fairly influential in, you know, conveying to them what is the moral thing to do.
So, thank you so much. I have one final question, and that is, since the audience, the main audience for this this conversation is national academies around the world and their members, and of course the broader scientific community, I just wonder whether you have any, I mean, we've talked about information and communication. I wonder whether you have any other thoughts about ways that these actors can play a role in not only working to find vaccines and treatments, effective treatments for COVID, but also to look at these sort of, well, these human rights issues, right, related to making sure that people's basic human dignity is respected in the context of a pandemic.
Yeah. Yes, certainly. I think, of course, we have extremely good experts at the moment in countries like the US, etc. That's why it's such a puzzle. US has the best hospitals, best scientists, and you have such huge numbers of deaths. It's a puzzle for us to keep looking at. I was part of the Global Health Index group of NTI, and we rated US and UK on top. US was on top. So we are breaking our heads as to what did we do wrong, you know, that it's turned out like this. Yeah, as far as the academies are concerned, I know some of the academies have social sciences also included. And medical sciences will definitely have psychiatrists and psychologists. And I think they can play a major role in trying to really give, you know, research this aspect. I'm sure they are doing it also. And how to, it's a big thing, problem for us, even in India. Behavioral changes, you know, how do you may give advice, but whether it's accepted and whether it's implementation, you can blame the government, right? But whether it's accepted by society, and how long it for the societal set to change, you know, things like that. We need information on that very badly, I think, at the moment. So I was very interested that the International Science Council, which used to be called ICSU before, they took social sciences also as part of them. Now it's called International Science Council. And there we are, that's why we are addressing this freedom and responsibility of scientists and communication, and how we should communicate and how we can communicate our so-called expert advice sensibly to both the politicians as well as to the public.
That seems to me such a crucial point, that this kind of problem challenge calls for so many different types of expertise. You know, of course, we need our public health experts. We need social scientists. We need human rights experts. We need to pull from wherever we can. But Dr. Nath, you know, I don't know whether you have any other final remarks.
No, I was just going to say that this aspect is really very important about, you know, the society accepting your advice. With the vaccine round the corner for COVID, how many will accept the vaccine and how many will not? Democracies will face a problem with people accepting. So I think it is important that the academies get involved in this kind of behavioral sciences, you know.
Because of, again, you know, back to this issue of trust, right? And do people have trust in a vaccine? And the crucial link there with transparency and effective communication. Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, what a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you so much for taking your time to speak with me about this.
Thank you.